now that we've created the HTML5 structure for our content and have defined our structural layer, it's time to move on to our presentation layer and our CSS for this so that we can make our HTML, which is right now very simple and kind of just looking like this, actually represent the visual look and feel of our design. So let's go ahead and start with that presentational layer, our CSS. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do with that is actually create my CSS file and then add a CSS reset to that so that I get rid of all of the browser defaults. The only reason why this is big and bold and the sizing and spacing that's here exists is because they represent the browser defaults for those things. But responsible designers often will use browser resets to write over the browser styles and make sure that they explicitly style everything that they want themselves rather than relying on any of the browser styles. And I like to do that here. I don't like to actually have the influence of any of the browser styles that are a part of my document. Those are kind of going to be irrelevant to me. And so there's some good CSS resets out there on the web that you can find. If you search for the one by Eric Meyer and what's called the sort of reset CSS, that's one of the most popular ones, and you can kind of take a look at what this does. And the goal of this is to really zero out any of the margins and heights and sizes and reduce browser inconsistencies by not using browser defaults. And so Eric Meyer has a kind of sample of what he recommends, and there's other resets out there as well. You'll notice that he's doing things with tables, but basically he takes every element and sort of zeroes out the padding and the border and the font sizes and things like that for across all of these. He's also getting rid of bullets that would be part of your list items, etc. I often will use a version of this that I sort of create on my own. I don't always use the exact same thing here, but this is a really good one. There's others that are out there. Some of them are a lot more detailed in terms of how much that it might reset, and there's other sort of CSS resets that would also normalize and try and actually create really consistent experiences across browsers. To begin all of this, though, I'm going to need an actual CSS file. So some people put their reset file in a separate external CSS style sheet. I'm going to go to my CSS designer and create my own style sheet for this by creating a brand new CSS file. And I could name it whatever I want. I'm going to call it demo.css right now. But I could name it sort of whatever I wanted and click OK. And now we've got ourselves a CSS file set up. And our code is referencing that file up here within our style sheet. So inside of that now, inside of my style sheet file, what I might do is copy over my own reset. So I've just pasted that in and my own browser reset to get rid of margins and padding and borders and outlines and all kinds of stuff that I might not want initially. So I'm going to kind of get rid of those things. I also want to make sure that I add to my reset that I'm going to be using the box sizing property of border box, which would allow me to size something and have the padding and border be set internally. So if I say that the overall container of something is 500 pixels, let's say, and then I add 50 pixels of padding, that gets added on the inside so that my content with 50 pixels of padding would only be 400 across, but the overall box would stay 500. By default, if we don't add that padding and that border would be added as additional size, and I prefer to not do that. So I'm going to go ahead and use this box sizing property as part of my reset, just to let you know that that's there. Once we add this reset, if we go to the live view, you'll see that all of the styles are gone, right? There's no bolding, there's no spacing that's here. We've really reset all of those things, and that's the whole goal of the browser reset, is to kind of get rid of everything so we start with a blank slate, so that when we begin our own custom styles, then they're going to be our own, that we're going to define all of the styles that we need. So I like to then begin with my own styles by defining some of the global styles that are going to be here. So I'm going to use a little comment here that says I'm going to start with my global styles. And sometimes it's a good idea to structure this. Like I might actually plan I'm going to, here's where my header styles are going to go. maybe later on my page I have something that represents where my nav styles are going to go. So I'll sort of paste that in, and I'll say, okay, here's where the navs are going to go. And like maybe later I've got one that's going to represent sort of where my branding will be and where my content will be. And I could sort of populate these in ahead of time if I know that I'm going to have those things. So I'm going to have one called content, for example. Maybe later, if I have different media queries, I might have one for media queries. So I like to kind of maybe add some comments so that I can quickly scroll through my CSS to sort of figure out what sections are being represented. And I tend to keep my CSS in a similar structure to my source code. So you'll see that it starts with the header and then the nav, which is in that, and then the content later on, rather than some other structure. So I kind of keep the same general structure that I have in my HTML within my CSS so that I can easily kind of find where things might be. So if I wanted to find how I'm styling this H1 within the article, within the content, I can kind of know that that's not going to be at the very top because I'm going to style the header and nav first. I'm going to find where that is within my CSS. So turning to my global styles, by global I mean these are really things that are going to apply everywhere. Maybe it's my default sort of baseline styles. So given that, I'm going to do that here to the body tag, and I'm going to set up what my default sizes for my fonts might be. If I have any backgrounds that are part of the page by default, I could put that stuff in. My font families, my font weights, all of that stuff can go there. Now, I was using some web fonts like this Railway font, and so I do need to bring in those web fonts as well. So going over to maybe Google Fonts or wherever I would get those, I need to sort of copy that stuff into my source code. I don't think you need to watch me do that, so I've just gone over to Google and got the fonts that I wanted. And I'm going to put those in prior to my CSS definition. I'm going to put a link out to the sort of Google fonts that I wanted to use. And in this case, I'm going to use Railway. I've got a variety of sort of font sizes that I'm using for Railway. For some reason, I've maybe defined, anyway. And then I also am using a font called Oswald that I'll use later. And so now that I've got those fonts set up, I can define that as a global reference inside of my CSS that's here. So I'm going to say, okay, my global font family, and that's going to be the default font that everything is using, is going to be that Railway font, and I can reference that particular font. I do want to back those up with a web safe font of some kind, maybe finally just say sans serif as a final backup for that. But that will translate all of this stuff. If I go to live view, you see that the font is updated now, bringing in that Google font. Then I could go back here to my code and add some of the other styles that I want. I'm going to say that my font size, and if we look at my Photoshop document, I kind of know some of this, that my font size here was 15 pixels by 23 is sort of what I had planned. So 15 over 23. Well, that's what I'm going to use here. I'm going to say font size 15 pixels, and I'm going to give this a line height of 23 pixels, which is kind of what my planned structure was from that Photoshop document. So you can see sort of how that might be showing up right here. The other thing I could do is go over to Photoshop, and if we zoom in on some of this stuff, and I select that particular font style, let's go to my, go over here to my text, and there's where that font is. Some of those definitions are available to me. If I come on here and I say copy CSS, you'll see that I could actually come back into my CSS file, and right out of Photoshop, we could actually paste in some of that stuff. So it's kind of showing me what I'm using. And so you can see that it says font size 15 pixels, Railway. Here's the color that I was actually using for my default sort of font colors. So if I wanted to put that in as my sort of default font color, I could do that as well, or at least for that text. And, what it was using for line height, and it's adding more that I don't exactly want, but I do have the possibility of kind of just copying over. Well, what's there from my Photoshop document so that I could kind of see that stuff. The other way to get at this information is actually to use the extract panel within Dreamweaver. And this is, again, somewhat new to Dreamweaver CC. You have to upload and have connectivity and be able to upload your files to the Creative Cloud. Once they're there, I could actually select this particular demo that I have within the Creative Cloud, and here's my extract panel for that demo. I could zoom in on that a little bit more, for example. And then in this particular case, I'd be able to select some of the text that I have here and see what colors and fonts and sizes and line heights I'm using. So this extract panel becomes really useful for getting content out of your PSD. You can see that I can both select this and see different CSS, which I could even copy. I'd be able to paste that CSS in somewhere else, and there's all the sort of CSS, right? The railway font. Here's the color that maybe I wanted. I could populate that into my global styles. You know, it's telling me what's my font weight, what's my sort of default line height, 15 and 23. I've already populated that stuff in, but that's another way that I could get at that information if I really wasn't sure what was in my Photoshop comp. I should also mention that, you know, it's useful for like getting colors out, so I could see what that color is. If I select any of my color swatches that were here, which is partly why I put them there, I could get at that background color really quickly. Oh, 7C9F47. I'd be able to see what that is. And this same extract panel also allows us to extract out assets. So for example, if I wanted to take these shapes, and it's sort of hard to see this, but it kind of shows me what size that is if that was a div. It has a width of 20 and a height of 100 pixels, right? Well, if I select two of these, I could actually then download that as a graphic asset. So I can multiple select by holding down Shift. Click right here, I'd be able to download that particular rectangle or whatever it is as a graphic asset, put it into my like images folder, for example. I'm going to select that folder and give it a name. So I'm going to call this just sample branding, you know, thing. Let's say I call it that. It's a PNG with transparency, just to kind of show you. Once we've saved that asset now is extracted into the place that I wanted it to be. I could go to my Files panel here, look inside of the images, and there's that sample branding thing that I just created, and I extracted that right out of my Photoshop comp. It's an easy way to get your content out of Photoshop and sort of back in to use within your CSS, right? So I'm going to, you know, collapse that particular panel, but just to sort of show you that if I go into my code or go to my design view just for now, and I wanted to just see that graphic, let's go ahead and just insert it into the page here, be able to just drag and drop that in. There's that graphic that I actually was able to extract out and put back into my design. So I would use that graphic later as a background image in all likelihood, but you could see how I could use that extract panel in order to get some of the assets that I want out of Photoshop and back into my design relatively quickly, or to get information about things like what size is that thing, what fonts and styles are there. I'm able to copy some of that text, some of that CSS, and put that right back into my design. So Dreamweaver and Photoshop have methodologies that enable you to get that content sort of back into Dreamweaver a little bit more quickly, rather than having to go back and forth all the time and look at stuff. So there's a few things that we can look at right there in order to make that happen. I'm going to delete that. I didn't want it, but you get the idea here of how I could get some of those assets or some of that information out. So I'm starting here with my global definitions for the body, and that's absolutely fine. I'll go ahead and leave that for now. I actually know that I had one more. I was using a default sort of font weight for things of 500, so I'm going to go ahead and put that in as a default font weight as well. And so now within our live view, we can kind of see there's our design at the moment. Not exactly where we want, but we're starting on our CSS. And I'm ready to move on to other sort of aspects of my site, such as the header and whatnot. I do want to mention I've already sort of built most of the graphics that I needed for this. I wanted to show you how you can use the extract panel to get graphics out. One other last thing to mention is another way that I could have gotten that same sort of graphic out. And if I save this out, we could see that this is called the branding arrow. I've got that in a folder here called branding arrow. I could turn that on and off. Another way that I could actually extract that would be to give this a name. Let's say I called it branding arrow, but I'm gonna get rid of now the spacing, and then I just said .png to the end of that. So if I just add the file extension that I want for this, one of the things that you're able to do is turn on something called the generate image assets. So with that checked, it will automatically make that graphic for me inside of an image assets folder of where this might be saved. And so that branding arrow JPEG can be being generated automatically. Just to show you where that is, I'm going to pop over to my sort of source folder for all of this stuff, and you see that it has this folder called iPoint New Site Development 11, which was sort of my PSD name because it went through a variety of stages here, right? And then assets. And inside of that folder are any of these assets that I've maybe set up that way, and it will automatically generate those things. So there's that branding arrow PNG. What's neat about this is that it's a live thing. So if those arrows were to change in some way, maybe, for example, let's say I applied a color overlay effect to them where I changed the overlay color of those arrows to this purple color, just as an example. I'm not going to want that, but I changed that, right? If I look back at my branding assets folder, that's already changed. It automatically would update because this is a sort of live generation that's happening when indeed you have this generate image asset set up, and you're able to just add extensions to those things, like to the folder group that you want to turn into a single image or to a single layer that's going to be an image, and you can grab those images right out of Photoshop in that manner, generating those image assets that you need. So that's another really handy way to get content out of Photoshop now, and there's a video about that as part of the class that details the generating image assets in more detail. That will be a part of this class at some point as well, so you can look out for that. I'm going to turn off that color overlay effect. I don't actually want that. I can turn that off or just get rid of that. It's not something I wanted, and of course once I've gotten rid of it, it's back to its normal folder view. And what I could do is copy that branding arrow and bring it back into my images folder and just paste that in. I already have it in there, as you can see, but I could paste another one if I want. So I could take the content out that was generated and put it within my images folder if I needed those images. Now you'll see that I've already generated all the images that I needed for this. I've got the little icons that I wanted. I've got these different branding arrows, bullets, images, and our logo, and this header background. So I'm not going to go over sort of creating the graphics any further, but you get the idea of how we could use both the sort of generate assets within Photoshop as well as our extract panel inside of Dreamweaver in order to get some of those graphic assets and information out of our comp and into our code. So let's continue with a little bit more CSS in our next video.